although my name is on the cover of the book, that is not the important part of this, because what is far more important is all of the people who contributed to the book. And we have two people who I have drafted to join me up here, and they're very nice to have said yes, that they also had contributed stories to the book, and that is what makes the book so important. Each one of us that were working on the book, we all had different visions about what to do in regard to the book. We brought our own ideas there. My particular interest was to gather up as many stories from people around Holliston as possible and have them write about themselves, describing about their lives in Holliston, some history, background, and it's not only people who have been here all their lives, but what was very important also was to get the stories of people who had moved in 6 months before or a year before and all of their different experiences. And that's what I wanted for the format in the book. Now, there were other ideas and opinions that were brought in on it, and that's what makes the book so interesting, because it does take in a lot of different looks at the town history. My particular interest, of course, goes way back further than a lot of the other ones had written about. I wanted to go all the way back to, well, we can go to the glacial age if we want to really go all the way back to that far, but we didn't have anybody to interview back then. So, but I was really interested to see about, just to get what makes Holliston, what made it from the very beginning, and even what we inherited from Sherburne, for instance. And that really does add to what Holliston is about as well. And the parts that I had the most fun with personally had to do with the chronology of events, and also about the selected list of notable Holliston citizens. Now, there was absolutely no way that I could have included everybody. When I started out, I said, this is really a daunting task. Literally everybody in Holliston could have a two-liner on that list, every single person. And so, picking through it, I just tried to get, of course, I wanted to get A through Z, which wasn't too hard when you've got Adams in the beginning. And we went all the way to Jeffrey Zemer. Thank goodness we had a Z. And so, but it was really fun to pick out just a random list of different people. Now, I can take that list and I can keep adding to it. I have added a few names in the files that I have. Same with the chronology. Hundreds of things we could put into the chronology. I wanted to pick out things that were oddball bits of history, you know, like where the stocks were in 1823 and things of that sort, and just to show the gradual evolution of Holliston through history, right up to 100 years ago during the 1920s. For instance, that Pleasure Point, which is one of Holliston's recreation areas and had been around since the 1880s, and it's probably, I guess we consider it the very first piece of recreation land in Holliston. But it was privately owned up until the 1920s, and finally the town took it over and they paid $1,500 for it. I think we got a bargain. So those are the things that I really enjoyed. Now, I grew up in East Holliston. Now, Herb, where were you growing up in Holliston? Where was your neighborhood?
Well, at first, my family, originally, my uncle came to Holliston, and the house that is on the town seal, they call it the Timothy Leland house, that was my Uncle Bill's house, and I lived in that house for about a year while the house that I grew up in on Central Street was being renovated. The house on Central Street had been abandoned for, I don't know, a dozen years or more. There was just, you could hardly see the house. There were, vegetation, bushes, everything in front of it. So it took about a year to get that ready, but I had written a story for the Holliston Reporter at one point about my little journey at the what's called the Timothy Leland house, my Uncle Bill's house. Yeah. But in 1947, I think it was 1948, in the wintertime, just before Christmas, I remember my mother, answered the phone, and then she says, "Oh my God, Bill's house is on fire." and the house caught on fire, and there was no water in those days. It was a bitter cold, snowy day, and the house burned to the ground. So it was shocking to go down there and see this chimney standing up where this whole house had been, and I lived there, like I say. And we had one interesting story. There was a ram named Brutus that was my uncle was the vice president of the Craft Brewery, which used to be in Boston, and he was like a gentleman farmer. He had a couple of horses and a ram and some sheep and some chickens. So the ram was an ornery old thing. It would butt you. It didn't, wouldn't let anybody near it. But I could go down and lie down and put my head on his belly and just lie there. And my Aunt Suzanne would come and try to get me away, and the ram would say no. So, and the other interesting thing, there was a horse named Dickie, a male horse, and he used to like to gallop. He'd run all over the place, and when I got on that horse, he would only trot. He wouldn't gallop at all. So I don't know. I had some rapport with the animals, I guess. When I was growing up, so. But it was a much different town. 2,500 roughly people, and the center of town was where it is. But as soon as you went in any direction, there was a lot of land, some farms, cows. It was just a rural community, place where the Toffee Haven was a fair grain company. They sold feed and chicken feed and, farming supplies, hay, stuff like that. So it was a pretty rural agricultural place. And in the 60s, my Uncle Bill's land down on Concord Street there was the first real development of,
That's right. Yeah.
Roy Avenue and that whole area. That was he had 25 acres of land. So that was the first development. Then Skyview Terrace was the next one. And that was the beginning of the town's actual growth. And it started to change, but it took a while. But it was just, I used to go uptown and park my car, leave the windows open, leave my keys in the car, leave the camera in the back. I would go off with my friends. And the other interesting part of Holliston was Walter's Dairy. That was, as a teenager, that was the place that everybody would congregate after a football game or a dance or something. We'd go down there and hang out, and all the brothers there, all the Rosini brothers would be shooing us out of there, and we'd drive around the block and come back. They'd shoo us out again. We'd go buy a cup of coffee or something. But it was a simple place. I had a great bunch of friends. I was into cars when I was young, and I learned how to use Bondo and fix things up. And, we'd hang out together. And I don't know, we never had any money. We just always seemed to have something to do. They used to have dances up above Fisk's here, the EYC it was called.
That's right.
You could come up on a Friday night and you'd hear the music blaring through the center of town and kids up there dancing. It was really, I was fortunate. I wrote a story in the book there about growing up here. And I feel very fortunate that I landed here and that this was the town. I'm still here. I never thought I'd be here, but here I am.
I think that's the general thing.
I said to myself, if I threw a dart on the wall and it landed in Holliston, and I was transferred here for a job, I would have landed in a good place. So I guess I made peace with that. But. So the only other interesting story, when I was a kid, I went to a fireman's muster one time with a friend of mine's family, and I saw them with the old hand tub there shooting water, and they used to have a long piece of paper that was on the ground, and they measured the last drop, and they would measure it, and then there was a competition to see who could, squirt the water, shoot the water the farthest. So my aspirations at that time was to be a fireman. So we came back, and my friends and I, we decided we'd have what we call the junior fire department. So we got a whole bunch of hoses from the neighborhood, and we coiled them up in my backyard, and we have like races to see how quickly we got a couple of hoses together, and we made a little target we'd knock down with the water. So one day, and there used to be the fire whistle would blow, and you could tell where the fire was. So one day, the 113 was the area that we lived in. So the fire whistles blew 113. So I was always excited to see a fire, in my area.
Nearby, yeah.
So right up the street, there was a little brush fire. So I went running up there and grabbed some of the hose. I was just dragging the hose around. I was probably 11 years old, maybe. So at the end of the little fire, probably lasted an hour and a half, maybe. The fire, somebody, I probably assume it was the fire chief. He came up and says, "What's your name?" I says, I'm Herbie Brockett. He said, "Where do you live?" I says, "I live right down the street there." So about a week and a half later, my mother says, "You got some mail today." So I get the letter, I open it up, and there's a check for $1.14 from the town of Holliston with a notation helping to fight the fire.
That's great.
So I was thrilled. I was a real fireman. So anyway, I don't know. It's been interesting to see the changes in Hollis, especially the traffic and now the lights we have here. It's certainly come full circle from where, not full circle. It's come 180 degrees from where it was originally. But,
So what happened when you were approached to contribute to the book. How did that come about?
Well, Mary Greendale asked me to.
Typical theme.
Typical,
So there were two questions she asked me. The first was the one I just addressed. What was it like growing up in Holliston? The other one was I'm a Vietnam veteran. I spent a year in the jungles of Vietnam in 1966. And she said, did Vietnam change your life? Or how did Vietnam change your life? So I have another story in there, which I said, oh God, yes it did. So that's a more involved story. I'd be happy to share it if you want, but I'll let somebody else have the floor for a bit. So,
well,
any questions?
That is very typical about how we gathered some of the stories. I know that Bobby Blair and I, we started pushing the idea and promoting and inspiring people to do it. It was at the farmers market in 2022. And we were out there with our tables and everything and a few things to entice people to come up and talk. And we promoted the story that we were going to be getting a book together for 2024, and we wanted stories from everybody around town, all sorts of stories. We wanted you to tell us, like, was it like to live in Holliston, similar to your stories, but we also were asking for people, because some of them were skeptical. Well, I've only lived here for like a year, and I said, that's what we're looking for. That's exactly what we're looking for. We want people who have been here a short time. For instance, what brought you to the town? It could be something serendipitous. It could have been just that you had a relative living here or some other reason for it. And we wanted to hear how you came here, because that is a thing that I also found even throughout history about how people came here. For instance, of course, we had the original settlers that arrived along with the incorporation of Holliston from Sherburne, but also we had several waves of immigrants who came through. And of course, there was the very large and significant immigration of Irish that came to Holliston starting in the 1840s, and how they affected the town, how they changed the town, and what they became, which they became a very important part of the history of Holliston. We had others, such as a Jewish population of Polish and Russian Jews that came into Holliston. They settled and had farms that they promoted up on Hill Street and out at the end of Norfolk Street, out in that neighborhood. And they were a very interesting group of people too, and they added a lot to the town as well. And we had a lot of other people who have come in, and even today we are still getting immigrants that are coming to Holliston, and they all have interesting and valuable stories to tell. And we went out there trying to find as many of them as we possibly could from all of those particular groups and ethnic groups to tell their stories. And when you read through this book, you will find a lot of their stories, which is really great. It's marvelous. But there's other things about Holliston too. It's about the things that we see all the time and we don't pay too much attention to. And one thing that has really changed the landscape and also the attitude and all sorts of the culture of Holliston is the rail trail. And that's why I'm asking you to speak about that, about the impact of the rail trail and how important it is. Walking that, I mean, I met up with a lot of people. We stopped to talk, and also the other group that we find walking along there, the dogs. People walking the dogs. I have met so many wonderful dogs. And I know some of them by name and everything. And it's wonderful to see that. So tell us about the rail trail.
Okay.
Because I used to play on the railroad tracks. You know, we've been in East Holliston, down by Mill Pond and everything. That's where we used to play, up on the bridge.
On the bridge, 8-arch bridge. Yeah.
8-arch bridge, above it, below it, around it, and all. So it's a very important part for me, too.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I'm the newcomer in town, especially sitting at the table with these people who've been here for their whole lives.
But that's important.
But I've been here for 35 years, and
oh, is that all?
yeah, so I'm a youngster when it comes to that. And so I first moved.
Yeah, I know.
So I first moved to town. I was living in Framingham, and I was working for an engineering firm.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, this had good schools, and we were planning on having children. And so soon after we moved in, we had our first one and only child, Andrea, that came into town. And so way back then, I got interested in working on the rail trail. Originally, I was just working with the engineering firm who did some of the initial, the concept plan and the cost estimate in order to get on the grant program. And I was sort of, interested in it, but not that much. But then I started working on a number of projects. One was, or two of them were in Arlington. And I had met up with a town planner who has ties to roots here, McClellan. And Alan McLennan, I think it was. Alan McLennan.
Oh,
Alan?
Walter?
He was the town planner of Arlington at the time.
Oh, okay, so yeah.
And so I met up with him a number of times because I was working on these projects in the downtown Arlington, and he was really gung-ho about how that had really changed the landscape of Arlington, because of all the exodus of the downtown area, all the businesses moved out. Because of the rail trail, the Minuteman Trail in Arlington and Lexington, it had really revitalized the downtown, so they were getting more business. And so I said, hey, Holliston can really use that as well. And so that got me interested in it, and I started going to various rail trails just to experience it. Take my daughter bicycle riding and that sort of thing. So I met her back in, 1997, I think, somewhere around there. And so in 97, things were starting to move along. We got funding from the Transportation Improvement Program. They called it the TIP program, and that was initially part of the feasibility study that I had done, or not the feasibility study, but the initial plan and cost estimates were able to get us the funding for that. But then right around 1998, CSX took over the property, and it says, okay, we're not going to give you the first 2 miles of land. You're going to have to buy it from us, And by the way, we're not going to sell anything for 3 years, So that put a quash in things, and so we took that opportunity to start building support for the trail, because back then there was not a lot of support for it. Oh, it's a luxury item. Nobody's going to use it.
Nobody would use
it. And it's comical because we average 714 people a day using the trail over the whole year.
Wow.
$250,000 a year using it. And so, but back then there was, the finance committee didn't want to support it, the select board didn't want to support it. So I just sort of went around to all the various groups, the Garden Club and the Lions Club and all these different groups to try to build support for it. And so little by little, we were able to do that. But, and then at that time we said, well, when CSX finally said, okay, we're ready to sell, we said, well, maybe we should not buy the piece that's at the western end of town. Let's buy the piece that's in the downtown area. Let's build that first. And so Herb was, I say Herb has had every bit of construction on the rail trail, Herb has had a hand in. He's always done everything, and coordinating all the contractors and getting the gravel, getting the stone dust, whatever. But we built that first piece in the downtown area. And then once people saw that and loved it, and they said, wow, we want more, it was a lot easier to get support. And a couple weeks ago, I was helping Franklin with it's called the Southern New England Trunkline Trail. And so they were debating about whether to purchase a piece from CSX for their rail trail. And so I went and gave a talk to them. It was funny when I went to the town council meeting, and I could see they were all gung-ho about supporting it. And I was like, well, when I did this, it wasn't like that.
Zero.
Yeah, it was no support. And so we tried to do things differently. So rather than going the Transportation Improvement Program, we went through small grants and did a lot with volunteers. And so we've, through the years, we had 26 Eagle Scout projects, plus a number of other, Brownies, troops, and all that, doing all kinds of projects. But we had a lot of volunteers, a lot of groups. The Garden Club puts trees on the trail, and so it's been a volunteer effort, and we got most of the town. I think I quantified like almost 1,000 different people working on the trail, actually physical labor on the trail, whether it's cutting trees or pulling weeds or that sort of thing. 1,000 different people, and I don't know what I'm up to, like 12,000 hours or more of volunteer time on that, but a lot to do with Herb volunteering his time and doing that.
Well, please don't ever pave it. All right, don't pave it. Please.
Could I add something to that? What
Yeah.
Robert said?
Yeah.
I've been involved, like Robert said, for both of us for a long time. But it's been such a lesson in perseverance to me, because at the beginning, like you said, there was nothing. We had no land and we had no money. All we had was an idea. And I'm like, how can this ever happen? It was like, this insurmountable task of trying to build a trail on a railroad with nothing. But it's amazing how, like you said, you built the first piece of it, and it, caught people's eye, got their attention, and people started to show up a little bit. We got a little more money, and one by one, step by step, it came to fruition, and here it is today. And it's, for me, it is the gift that keeps on giving. Every time I drive down by Blair Square, because I come down Central Street there, and I see people on the trail, I say, wow, this is such a great thing, and I'm so happy to be a part of it. Is the king of the
trail.
roost here that is responsible for all the paperwork and endless meetings, and my God, he deserves the king's hat here.
And I know that recently there was a program had to do with playing music in the tunnel. All right, music in the tunnel.
Yes.
Well, anyway, I would advise everybody, and I've done this. I've gone up there and I brought a harmonica. Yeah, bring a musical instrument, anything. Because many years ago, and I know that you probably remember him, but John Dirth, who was a musician and grew up in town, and for a few years, I lived in the same house as his mother, and he would come back and forth from New York, and he was a jazz musician. And he would go up to the tunnel to practice. He was a trumpet player. He played the trumpet. Yeah. And one time I had gone up there, and this is when there was still rails in there, and at night and in the evening, just about when it was getting dark, he would go up there, and I one time heard the music coming out of there was just downright haunting, absolutely haunting. So I would advise that, even with the harmonica, it sounds really good. And one time I was walking along, and there were two little girls on bikes, and they were going into it, and I said, hey, come on, let's go in. When we get into the tunnel and everything, they said, what? I think they thought it was, kind of crazy. But I said, go woo, 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 get the echo going. And they were afraid to do it at first, but then they did it, and they said, oh, this is really funny, this is really great. And I said, well, do that every time you go through here. It's just wonderful. But there was one night, long time ago, it was when my daughter was growing up, and she had a friend over, sleepover and everything. It was a hot August night. And never was. So anyway, we walked along the railroad up to the tunnel. I guess this is like after dark. And we were walking up there, and we were telling the stories, and I had heard one story from Braggville about a man, and they used to do this, they would get up on the train not to pay, either going to or from Milford. And they would get up on the train and go through the tunnel, but they had to make sure that they laid down. All right, so the story was, though, that when the train went through, that this guy didn't lay down, and his head was knocked off and never found. All right, so we're telling these ghost stories going up there. So we get up there, we got ourselves so just oh my gosh, we were just absolutely scared to death. So we said, we're not walking back through. We got up on Highland Street and walked back down Washington Street. So we were just about at the corner of Highland and Washington, just turning. This is probably 11:30-ish at night. And the police cruiser stopped and said, well, ladies, what are you doing so late? And we told him the whole story and everything. He says, okay, carry on. So we walked the rest of the way. They let us, he let us walk the rest of the hill. So we don't have that far to go. We just have to go down to the bottom of the hill and all that. And so it's just really, I think about that every time I go through there. And it is. It's a really interesting piece. It's a fun place to be and everything. It's loaded with history, which is really right up my alley and everything. And yes, do bring a musical instrument with you when you go up there. It works beautifully. So thank you very much for all of that.
The other little piece about Hollis, and
Yeah.
one more thing
Yeah,
about,
yeah,
the,
yeah.
about the train here. That we used to be able to get on the train. I don't know where Casey's is now.
Yeah.
And for 20 cents, ride to Framingham and get off in the center of town and go to what
Go
was
to the
called
movies, yeah.
St. George Theater
Yeah,
for
St.
another
George,
20 cents
yes,
and see
that's
2
right.
movies
Yeah.
and get back on the train.
Yes.
That
Yeah, I did that once when I was a little kid. I think it was the first movie I ever saw. That first is in Westwood Ho the Wagons or whatever.
But you had 2 movies too.
Yeah, and so I remember going, but what was really neat, that the part that I don't remember much about the rest of the trip, except for coming back to Holliston and going over the 8 Arch Bridge, and it's like flying. You're looking, you're looking out there, and you're up like this. You don't see the sides that you're going over. No, yeah, then you got to lean over to see that, and then you're going over the bridge, and it was just like flying.
Well, the story I had heard was the original 8 Arch Bridge had just railroad ties sticking beyond the actual
Yes,
granite
yes,
structure.
that's right.
So if you look at the old photographs, you'll
Yeah.
see maybe even
You-
it shows it.
Yeah, there are some pictures on that, yeah.
that had,
Just
the
the
rail
ties.
ties, and that drove the engine.
Yeah,
The engineers
Right,
crazy.
way down.
Yeah, you see how
yeah,
that
just like,
overhung?
it was like that.
And that drove the engineers crazy, and so they built a concrete enclosure on top of the granite later.
Yes,
Probably
in
in the
1920s, I
20s,
think,
yeah.
yeah, in the 20s.
They added that
Yeah.
later, and that's what we eventually had to remove and redo. with the-
Well,
with
there
the
was one
structure.
man who was walking back from the cider mill in East Holliston, and I guess he wasn't paying too much attention, and the train came up behind him. Maybe he spent a little more time at the cider mill than he should have, because it wasn't just
Fermented.
cider that he was, yeah, because that was back at the time when it was mostly hard cider they were making. But anyway, so he's at he gets him halfway out on the bridge.
Oh my God.
And the train's coming up, and it ain't gonna stop because I don't even know if they. Well, anyway, he grabbed the side of those railroad ties, but the train went over his arm.
Ooh.
Another gruesome story about the railroad. Yeah.
know this.
Yes, that's.
Not a
Yeah, I
good
have that
ending.
in my notes somewhere. Yeah. Yeah. Those are the things I liked collecting out of the old newspaper. This is back in the 19th century and everything. So another gruesome tale. Another gruesome tale.
So the other part about Robert that he didn't tell you is his crusade against graffiti.
Oh, yes, yes.
So
Oh,
every
my
week,
God, yes.
Every month in our rail trail meeting, we get this
Get a
bill,
bill.
from what was in Iowa for another
yeah.
gallon of paint. So we can paint over the graffiti. But
Yeah.
you should tell them a little story about the writing up on
Oh,
the top. of it.
it's actually a funny story.
That's a good.
This was years ago, but we kept getting tagged with graffiti inside the tunnel, and so I painted over it. The guy repainted it again, and he said, "Oh no, there was 2 different things," and they thought it was the DPW was covering it over, and thought it was a game. And so the one above the south side of the tunnel,
Right.
heading towards Milford,
Yeah.
that big wall up there,
That big
they had
this
painted up
concrete
there.
wall,
So I
yeah.
climbed up there, and I'm hanging off with a roller trying to paint this. And I noticed that somebody had written, it says, "If you can read this, the game is on." So the graffiti artist did this. So I painted over all his graffiti, and I took a marker, and it's probably still up there if it's not too faded. But I said, "If you could read this, smile for the camera." Never hit it again.
Beautiful. Oh, I know that used to bother me. The graffiti. I don't know. That seems. I'm hoping that has.
It comes and goes.
I suppose,
It-
because, I mean,
that's
somebody
right.
had painted, what was it, High Mom on the Balancing Rock. Yeah, that was another one. Yeah, I know. Oh, and then, of course, there was some vandalism on the 8 Arch Bridge. And that, that's pretty much painted up.
tough.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Balancing Rock, back in years ago, there was always, well, I've heard stories,
Yeah, me
but somebody
too.
would try to go up there when it was balancing with a hydraulic jack and try to
Yes,
make the thing do what it's done.
I heard it was
So-
the Campus Hall brothers.
Well, I don't know. I never heard any names, but
That's what my father told me,
It wasn't a Brockert by any
Was it not?
I tried to
Was it
tip-
Brockert?
So somebody made it.
Well, my father said it was them, and it
Yeah,
didn't
so
work out. Yeah, it
but
broke.
that was another
It broke the
challenge,
jack,
but
and that was it.
Seals
Yeah.
can chip that rock over. So.
Oh, heavens. I mean, these are some things, a few of these things have made it into the book, but of course we could not get everything into the book. And that's the problem with history anyway, because we keep finding new history all the time. I mean, these stories and everything. And we could probably do another 400 pages quite easily. But the thing is that maybe someday there will be another 400-page book, but it's going to have to be the next generation. And one of my big concerns is, who are we going to get to pass on all of this history to get carried on? I mean, this is one of the big concerns I have. You know, I got the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, from Dorothy Reese. And she told me, gave me a few pointers and everything about what she would have liked to have spent more time writing about. And that's what I would say to the next generation coming along too. She had told me that she wanted to spend more time writing about just the common people. She said that a lot of histories that were written all the way back, they would talk about the selectmen, the ministers, and all that. And even in Holliston's history, there was an article in the 1880s, Holliston's Moneyed Men. And I guess everybody was impressed with them, but I wanted to get down to the people, the everyday people that really had a huge effect on history, but were never recognized for it.
How about Burger Kennedy?
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
Burger Kennedy was an icon here in town back in, I don't know, the 60s, I guess, somewhere in that vintage. And
Yeah,
I guess he
50s,
was a World War II veteran who, in those days, they call it shell shock. But he used to ride around on a bicycle, and it wouldn't matter if it was 80 degrees or 80 below degrees. He had this big, heavy trench coat on. I think I remember he had a beard. And I guess it's...
He wear his boots too.
Boots, yeah, okay, you know about Burger,
Yeah.
But the other thing that was odd about him, he would buy a bottle of Coke and put mustard around
At Tito's, Tito's
drink the
country
Coke with
store.
mustard on it.
Yeah.
So he was harmless, I guess, but he was...
He was a little
And I guess
scary looking. I think
well,
he
he
was
was,
a
but
little
he-
intimidating.
I don't think he was ever
appearance.
a problem. The
No.
other one is Robert Hart, the can man. That's a
Yeah,
more recent.
yes, that's more recent time,
He's
sure.
somebody I knew from
Yeah.
high school, actually.
Oh,
and,
yeah, he was.
Yeah,
he
yeah.
actually used to work at Parker Products when with a
that's
swing place down there was a
Yeah,
snack
yeah.
food company named called Parker Products, and he used to make the bacon rinds basically.
Big rides, yes.
They
Oh my
take a
gosh, yeah.
pig skin and chop it up in little pieces and fry it, and that was his job.
That was his job, yeah.
He was the bacon rind king
Yeah.
down there. But then he just, his later career was a can.
Like cans,
walking
yeah.
around with his big bag of cans. But
So-
he was also harmless too. He was,
yeah.
actually a nice guy, but I don't know how
Yeah.
he chose that. But
There were a lot of interesting characters like that always. There was always someone. And a lot of times in the early years, it was usually somebody who had an issue. Like one of the ones that I had followed in 19th century was a Civil War veteran. And he and his brother had signed up together, and they were both, 18 and 20 years old when they enlisted. And they were Irish immigrants, had come over from Ireland just a few years before and go off on the adventure and everything. And off the war they go, and they were both POWs. Both brothers came home at different times when they were released, and one brother did pretty okay, he was fine. But his other brother was not. And he had all of the obvious signs of PTSD, even though they never called it that. But the town tried to support him along and give him little jobs to do, and just try to maintain and support him and everything. And he lasted until the age of 82. He died at Westboro State Hospital, which at that time was kind of like, it also served as a nursing home for the elderly. We didn't have all these nice places like Timothy Daniels and all that. There was much. But he lived till 1922, and the town supported him the whole way. And it was really quite tragic, though, because he would show up in the newspapers, and you could see what was going on with him, and then also how the town was, how it was doing. At one point, he had been sent off to jail for some violation he did, but when his brother died, they allowed him to come back, And the police officer that he had assaulted, that put him into the jail, was the one that escorted him for the whole time that he was here. And then he went back. But that's what the town was like. I mean, they were really able to support people in different ways that we see it today, but on a more personal basis. So, and there's
Also a lot smaller, too.
well,
There's
and
a difference, too.
Yeah, and a lot fewer resources, so to speak, than we certainly have now. And it's interesting to see, how the people reacted, how they did the best they could supporting them, and a lot of other things. I mean, even, I kept tracking, I have all these little files with different subjects and everything. One of them has to do with medical. I was looking at different diseases. We have the Great Sickness, which, everybody was always curious about. Well, what was it? Well, we don't know. A lot of people died. There were diphtheria epidemics where you would have 6 and 8 children dying within a few weeks of each other. And smallpox. When was the last smallpox case in Holliston? 1902. It was even that close. Yeah, I mean, it was a lot more recent than you'd realize. And it's just interesting to see how did they deal with them. Well, they certainly had no idea about germ theory. But it's interesting to see how they handled that particular situation when they would have epidemics that would come through. The other stories that are a challenge to find have to do with history of women. Women don't end up in many stories at all, and you really have to dig into that to try to find out what their lives were like. And that's interesting to me too. Those stories that are filled with mystery and misunderstanding, and that really do need to be brought out a lot more. We did have a lot of interesting women, and a lot of them that were very independent. We had writers, lots of writers, and today I find it really interesting to see that we have many women today in Holliston who have been writing, for instance, children's books. A lot of them right up here in the library. But we had a children's author back in the 1870s and 80s, and she was writing children's books such as they were back then. Quite a contrast to what you see now. Mostly they were to try to teach children good manners and ethical behavior.
That's a good idea to bring something like
I know, really, I was really interested, marvelous, And musicians, for instance. I mean, we mentioned John Durth, but we had musicians back in the 19th century. George Whiting, that he was an organist. How in heaven's name would a man in Holliston become an organist or a composer and all that? Well, because there was an organ factory right over in Millis. Interestingly enough. And not only that, I mean, there's history that's all around town. There's history in your house. Even if you live in a new house, you're still starting the history of that house. I look back in mine, I can't imagine how the Connell family had 7 children in the house that I'm living in, but they did, it was no problem. And a couple of the interesting part on this was, in regard to women, was that it was an Irish immigrant family. And apparently the tradition was, and listen up to this, ladies, when they would buy a house, and the man's name would be on it on all the records. Mine was Thomas Connell. But actually what Thomas did was, and it was a tradition, that they would sign over the deed to the women. And the women would be the actual owners of the house. And why was that? Well, apparently they figured that the women were better handlers of money at the time, and that's why they did it. And it was a very common occurrence. So the women would have it. And so it was, I consider it the Mary Connell house. Forget about it, Thomas. But with all the 7 children, and I looked at, what did these children do? What did they become? Well, there was one daughter, Mary the daughter, who worked in the straw hat factory. Her sister Katie was deaf, and she graduated first in her class in the Hartford, Connecticut Asylum School for the Deaf. Pretty good. And I think she then went to work in the straw shop too. A couple of the boys were on a lot of the town baseball teams. Another one, Martin, which I found was really interesting, was a concert violinist. Interesting. He was in an orchestra, apparently, that was their home site was the Vanderbilt Estate down in Asheville, North Carolina. Interesting. He also played concert violin in an orchestra at various locations in Hartford, Connecticut. And then also, what did he do for his third his third occupation? He came back to Holliston and he taught music in the Holliston school system. That's where he ended up. And so, but that's the history of the house. I still, kind of listen late at night and see if I can hear any ghostly violin music. Haven't heard any yet, so. But that's, but that's history that happened in my house. And everybody has a house, no matter how old or how new it is. Houses have history. And if you have a new house, well, you are now responsible to start the history in your house. And there are several houses around town where people have kept folders about who the people were that were living in the house, and they would add it onto it, which is really an interesting thing. And some of these things ended up in the book. And you will read some of them about people who have taken on a house in Holliston. And those were some of my favorite stories that are in the book.
So there's another little piece of interesting history that's no longer with us, and that is the town dump,
Yes.
So-
Yeah.
where the recycling center is, used to be the dump.
Yeah. Where was
And-
the first dump?
All right, well, I don't know, the only one I have.
Union Street. Yeah,
Oh,
down
yeah,
the end
right,
of
right,
Union.
that's
Yeah,
before my
yeah.
time.
And then they
So-
were proposing to put it on Hollis Street
Right.
in the 20s and everything, and hue and cry.
But
But
Marshall Street dump.
that's why they went out to Marshall Street. That's right.
So
yeah.
the best, or
Yeah.
the trick about going to the dump was not to come back with more than
Yes.
because my first bicycle came from the dump.
That's
Three
right.
bicycles
Oh my
that we
gosh,
put together and painted.
Yeah.
But it was a great place for politicians to, meet
That's
the
where they
community. They
always
go up
did,
there on
yeah.
a Saturday or Sunday and do their campaigning, and people would come in with their trash. And, so it was, an event to go to the dump, really.
Yeah.
And,
I have a trunk. I got a trunk at the dump. Yeah.
So now it's
and
unfortunately-
refurbished it. It's beautiful.
changed.
It's on clothes.
Oh, my, I don't know, 80s, 90s, I don't know.
Yeah, 80s or 90s,
never
I
kept
think
track
it's
of
been.
when it
Yeah.
closed.
Yeah, I
But-
think it is. Yeah.
I mean, the downside was you could bring anything you wanted and throw it
Oh,
in the bank.
yeah.
So it's,
There must be a lot of stuff underground still there, huh? What do you think?
Well, sure.
if you had X-ray vision, probably be shocked. But
Yeah, I know.
I mean, now it's going to be a solar farm, so it's
It is already.
they're putting a solar farm on top of it.
Yeah. Well, that's.
Oh, yeah.
They did have the mini
Yeah.
mound there and everything with the pipes coming out, which you will see in a lot of other, areas like that. And it
Yeah.
really was. It was a social,
Yeah, it was-
social place. Yeah, before the rail trail.
I mean, kids used to go up with their 22s and shoot the rats. That was the other thing.
Yeah, right. Yes, that's
They
right.
do after school. You go shoot the rats. Things have changed.
Yeah. Oh. Well, another part of the book that really got a lot of coverage, thanks in part to John Shanahan, was the sports writing and all of those stories that he also brought up. And I don't know, did any of us play on sports?
Little League, yes.
You did? Okay, well, there you go. No, I did a few high school years and everything, but he really brought it out about not only about the sports that were tied in with the schools and everything, but also for instance, men's. The men's softball team and various other stories along like that too, which is really interesting because, for instance, when did athletics become part of school curriculum? For instance, how far does that go back? It goes back to the 1890s.
Did they have somebody injured playing football and the did away with football until about the early 60s
Well,
when they brought it
yes.
back again. That
Now,
was,
I asked around about that, and I got a lot of different stories about it, because that's the one that I heard.
Yeah,
And I even
know
heard that
that's
he
true,
was
but
killed,
there was
you
a
know. But-
period of no football, and then in the
Yeah.
60s, they
And who was it?
Sarah Salako,
I think it was Tom. It was Tom LaRonga and also Joe Gallerani. I had asked both of them that question. I said, that was a story we were always told that somebody got hurt, and they said no, they didn't think that was the reason. Even though the fact is that so many kids were getting injured in football at that time, they said it was because. Due to the small population in the high school of boys, they couldn't get a team together. Plus, it was more expensive to play football because of all the equipment.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah, that they couldn't get it going. The other sports that did stay, think about it going into the Depression. Also, a significant number of boys in high school did not finish. They went right out to work. They would cut it short by 2 years and sometimes even less. And they would go out to work, which also depleted the number of eligible players. And I know that there's a classic picture of the 1926 high school football team. But baseball stayed because we had the field. It only takes a bat and a ball, and maybe if you were lucky enough to have a glove, and that was it. And so it was a little bit more practical in that sense. Basketball was also really important because, first of all, you get this around your head that they played in the town hall, but they didn't allow them to play upstairs in the big auditorium because the powers to be in town were afraid that the basketball was going to break the windows, so they did. They first played on the floor where the town clerk's office is and all of that. And you'd imagine, the ceilings were like this, but not like you would expect. And not only that, but it's been covered up now, and I keep going around trying to find where they are. You're banging on the walls and everything. There were these large, huge cast iron beams that go through to the floor, that go up to the auditorium. And the thing is that the Holliston basketball players used to know how to play around them because they were in the playing field. They were on the court. And so they'd have to play around. And they knew how to better, hit the basket, little nuances and everything, now there were several, some high school teams that refused to come to Holliston to play, not only because of that, but because, this is one from, I read for Wellesley High School, refused to come to play in Holliston because they didn't have showers. They always like to shower after the game, I guess, before they went home. So they said, no, we're not going to play you anymore. So the thing was that finally they convinced that basketball was very important because we had a semi-pro team. Long before there was an NBA, there were many semi-pro teams all around eastern Massachusetts, and Holliston had one of those teams. And so our reputation as really good players, not only the high school team, but also the semi-pro team, it won us the chance to play upstairs. And there's some great pictures which show these gigantic nets all over the windows to keep them from hitting the windows with the ball. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until the 1950s when we got the new high school with a gym in it and showers that whole new culture changed. Yeah, but basketball was very important in Holliston. The baseball team was, and we had a semi-pro baseball team back in during the Depression years. And one of the great stories, I had interviewed one of the players. He was from Milford. Tate Bodio was his name. And he lived into his 90s. He was absolutely fantastic. And I asked him about it because I had heard that, Holliston had got him to come over and play a bit for Holliston too. Yeah, I did. Down at Green Street. And he said, we would pass the hat around and people would throw in a donation and then they would split it up. And I said, well, how much money did you used to get? Usually it's about 35 cents. And that was it. And one thing, as far as our history is concerned, in regard to like Green Street, for instance, keep your eye on the stone bleachers that are there, and I keep asking the park department, make sure you clear them all out and everything. It's a historic site. They were put there in the 1924 centennial era, back when we had the 200th anniversary, and those were set there as, I guess, part of the decoration for that year.
Is that also
Yeah.
pink granite?
It's going to be local, because they were going to, because actually, there was granite that was quarried right up above Powder House Hill. You can go up there, and of course, the houses are all there, but you can see where some of the stone was cut out, whether it was for there, or whether they cut, I kind of think it might have been leftovers from around the Bragville Milford area, I bet. I bet they carted them from there.
So,
Yeah.
sorry, Joanne, where are the bleachers?
well,
And
you-
Green Street, where?
Green Street, oh, well.
No, I know
yes.
where Green
Oh,
Street is,
no,
but-
yes, yeah. Oh, well,
Where are
you march right down there, you
First
take a
base.
look, yeah,
Behind first base.
yeah, right behind
On
first
the
base.
hill.
Okay.
Yeah,
Speaking of
On the
Green
hill.
Street,
yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, now you go down there and you do a little, pay a little homage to them.
on the 4th of July,
Yeah.
for quite a few years when I was young, they would build this gigantic pile of railroad ties and
Railroad ties
old
and
broken
everything.
crates up on the top.
That must have smelled
Oh,
good.
At
gosh,
Goodwill Park.
yes, yeah.
And on the 4th, the 4th of July, they'd light it off, and there was a monstrous bonfire. That was the big thing. There were no fireworks at the bonfire. You know,
Was it 1962 when
they lit it off
somebody
early,
said,
yeah, they lit it
somebody,
off early.
somebody lit it early, yeah.
I was going to say something else. You were talking about money a minute ago. The
Yeah.
culture of the town was
Yeah,
pretty blue collar there for a long while. And,
yeah.
I've never been a proponent of going to the town meetings a lot, but I used to go once in a while. And every time, something would come up, they want to talk about the school budget or
Yes,
the highway.
or
Somebody'd stand up
anything,
and they'd talk
anything.
about, can we afford it? No. And-
No, we can't afford it. No,
And today
no, we
it's
can't
like,
do it. Yeah.
yes, I need 7 million, yes, 30 million, yes, 200,000, yes. Nobody gets up and talks about how much it costs. That's gone. I mean, it's just. And I went to school up on the hill there. The one year, the old building that's gone now. There was,
Yeah.
I don't know what vintage that was, but the stairs. They were
1870s.
wooden stairs, and they were
Yeah.
so worn out that from people walking up there, you could literally
yeah.
pour a cup of coffee in it, it wouldn't spill because of the depression in the stairs. But, we had music in the town hall. We had a music class. We had to walk down the hill and go into the
Yes,
town
that's
hall. I
right.
mean, people made do with what they had. They didn't have this
Yeah.
luxury of, everything new.
Yeah.
And even I was in the new high school, which is now the Adams School, I guess.
Right, yeah.
And when they, renovated that place, I'm thinking, well, it's a new school. Why are they renovating it? And they literally ripped it apart and rebuilt it. So it's interesting how time goes by and things
Sure,
that were
yeah.
new and for me were new and now they're not good enough, I guess.
Well, we're all going to vote yes for a new library, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, don't get me going on that. Yeah, that's one of the things that I like to, talk about and try to promote. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I know. Yeah. We would have to have a whole session just on that, just talk about the history thereof and all that. Now, it's 4 o'clock, so we got like half an hour, and we want to open it up to questions because I know
Right.
every single one of you has a question in mind, and please feel free, try to stump us with it if anything. Yeah. All right, start right here.
Herb, you talked about the train, right where Casey's is, and you went to Framingham on the
Right.
train. Could you go to Boston from there, or do you have to
Yeah, I
go
guess
to
if you get
Framingham
on
and
the train.
change?
Framingham,
Yes, you
go.
could.
I
Yeah.
never went to Boston.
Yeah.
Did you change at Framingham, or get right
Yeah,
on?
you had to
Yeah,
change, yeah.
yeah.
So nice.
Well, there's a
Wow.
great story, but in the 1880s, there was a minister from Holliston. Okay, he got on the train, got to Framingham, connected there, and went all the way across the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can do that, all the way, and you can do it today.
Yeah.
And the thing was that he was on his way to Japan as a missionary.
Oh.
Yeah, and he wrote a series of letters that talked about leaving Holliston, getting on the train, and going out west and through the Rockies. Fabulous, fabulous stuff. Yeah, and that was yeah.
Are those in the library at the Historical Society?
Very
Those
good
are-
question,
Yeah.
You talk about the industry in Holliston
Yeah.
and like from the 1800s up to more recent times.
Yeah.
I just like to, probably not industry, but when I was young, the area, if you were up on the 8 Arch Bridge looking out to towards what's now kind of a field full of woods. But that was active cranberry bogs there. The Tempest
Yeah.
family owned those, and I would watch them. We would rakes, pick
Yes,
the
yeah.
cranberries, and they had an old, probably like a 1940 Ford Woody, thing that would be worth a fortune today, but they used to load the cranberries boxes onto that, and there's a house down there, that I don't know, BU owns or whatever, whoever owns it now, but that was the place that they take the cranberries and kind of, cull them
Cull 'em
and
out
put them
there.
together, but.
They
we
used to
always-
store them in the cellar of the town hall back in the
Yeah, but
1880s.
that's-
And not only that, those were all native berries too.
Yeah.
And you
But-
can still get a few of them if you know where to look on conservation land. Yeah.
In reference to that, I live across from the dump, though my husband doesn't like me to say that.
We know where you live.
So,
Yeah, we know where you live.
right, so, when I think of the history where my house is, which is a newer house, it was 1995 that was built, but it was on an old granite, quarry. But the property, all the streams and bogs nearby have been full of cranberries. I used to go and pick them.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, you find it all
Yeah.
through
I don't think we
there.
answered the rest of the question.
Oh,
The
yeah,
industry,
yeah.
Oh, the industry, well, in regard to industries, the first industries, of course, were shoemaking, boot and shoemaking. And that started back in like 1793 with Ariel Bragg. And he was the first one that made in bulk. And then you had the Batchelder brothers who came down in the early 1800s. There were 4 brothers. 3 of them made boots and shoes, and one of them decided to be different. There's always one of the kids in the family that isn't going to do the same as the brothers. He did cranberries. He was a cranberry grower. And so boots and shoes, straw hats.
There was a little casket manufacturer
Oh, yeah.
on Elm Street.
Well, that was one of those
Oh, is it Elm?
necessities.
No, right on the
What
corner
was
of
that?
Elm and
Yeah.
Hampshire, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. That was a very necessary occupation. Yeah, and straw hats were pretty popular up until around 1900, and then straw hats not only sort of went out of fashion, they were buying them up in the hinterlands, not so much towards the cities, but also we were getting imports from Asia, which kind of killed the local straw hat industry. And then we got into even sort of a second generation of boots and shoes with Arthur Williams and the Goodwill Shoe Company, which lasted right up until the 1950s. And of course, we have been bequeathed those buildings that have now been repurposed as well. As far as, say, what the other towns around us, like we're getting into electronics and all sorts of things like that, we never really got there. I mean, the only other side industries, for instance, down at Mill Pond, there was a cotton manufactory there in the 1820s, and then it went over to wool. That was later because cotton, where were we getting it? It was coming up from the south.
So what do you mean by a cotton factory? What were they doing in the factory?
Making textile cloth.
Cloth.
Yeah, making cloth, and then it went over to woolen mills towards the 1850s and so. And that lasted until late 1920s or so. And then the building was closed for several years. Depression comes on, and of course it was burned. So.
In the center of town, I was
Yeah.
thinking back, not industry necessarily, but there was a Aubuchon's Hardware, an A&P store,
Sure,
a
yeah.
store across the street, Williams Market, and another little Alexander's Market, all little
Alexander's,
grocery stores.
yes, oh yeah, yes.
And Fisk's,
Yeah.
that's been there forever, Annie
Yeah.
Fisk originally. And
Since the 1860s.
Boston
yeah.
Edison office and Jimmy Inch's was another
Jimmy
store. There
Inch's,
was
yeah.
an interesting little collection of stores
Yeah,
downtown.
right, yeah.
And it was probably in the 60s that they first, I mean, it wasn't really an industrial-based town at all. It was pretty
No,
rural,
not
but they-
really, no.
The October Hill there down on Concord Street, that industrial park, I think that was probably one of the first ones, or Lowland Street, even, there's another one.
Yeah, little,
there.
yeah, but
That they
October
started
Hill
to,
really went, yeah.
assign, zone areas for industry. Later on, Hoppingbrook